So it's a huge honor to be invited to speak to the Geoscience Forum. I mean, mining is so important to the Yukon economy, and it's just a great honor to be here to talk to you today about the past, the present, and the future of mining in the Yukon economy. Now, when I was a kid, some of my earliest memories are of my dad getting in the Suburban and going to Faro on business trips to sell pickups to the Faro mine. He was a car dealer in Whitehorse, and the Faro mine had a huge appetite for pickups. And in fact, my dad sold so many pickups to the Faro mine, and they drove them so roughly, so many came back to the shop for repairs or for warranty work, that the repair numbers were actually off the charts, like so literally off the charts. General Motors sent someone up from Oshawa to see what was going on at the Yukon dealership. And so my dad duly took the guy to Faro, showed him what they did to the pickups, and the guy said, yep. And he sent a telex, that was the day, back in the days, he sent a telex back to Oshawa that basically said, send more pickups. So, that was some of my earliest involvement. And of course, when I was a kid, my dad was, all constantly talking about mining. My friend's dad worked at Whitehorse Copper. My uncle worked on the railway, shipping the ore to Skagway. Everybody seemed to be involved in it somehow. And, if the adults were all into it, then the kids were too. So I owned one of these when I was a kid. Now, of course, I didn't own a 400-ton Komatsu. I owned the 2-pound Tonka toy version, which is why I got so distracted by the Pelly construction toy today. So me and my yellow truck, the other kids in the neighborhood in Riverdale, I had the dump truck, somebody else had the loader, someone else had the grader. We mined a huge amount of Riverdale mud, and it was so much fun. We drove my truck until the wheels came off. And so my dad actually went down to the office downtown and typed out a letter. For the young people in the audience, I was born before the internet. He typed out a letter to Tonka headquarters, put in a money order for a couple bucks, and after an interminable period, at least to me, new wheels arrived. And then when I got a bit older, the hockey trips started. So we would go to Faro, we would go to Cassiar, we had a great time. And it was kind of eye-opening, because those kids, when we billeted with them, they had satellite TV. And if one of their parents, well, all their parents worked at the mine or something, they would take you to the cafeteria. And it was like wonder of wonders, unlimited chocolate milk, I remember. And for a kid, that was pretty darn cool. Like not even the Rebel base camp in Star Wars had unlimited chocolate milk. So if you go back to if you go back and think about that time for me as a kid, there were a few certainties in life, right? There was, it got cold in the winter, the Leafs were the only hockey team on TV, and mining and the Yukon economy were pretty much the same thing. So when I saw this photo from Kathy Archibald's cool collection of Yukon mining photos, I knew it had to go in. But back at the time, that's what the kids thought. The adults thought the same thing. So I had the privilege a few years ago to interview legendary Yukon Commissioner Jimmy Smith, and he was telling me about the Carr Report. Now, back in the 1960s, he and the Minister of Indian and Northern Development, as it was then, got together, and it was about 25 years after World War II. The Faro mine was almost ready to go into operation, and they thought it's a good time to do some long-term economic planning. And of course, Smith, he had a big focus on getting stuff done in the here and now, but he was also the kind of leader that thought about the future and didn't think small. So they got this guy named Dr. Carr to do a long-term economic study for them. And Jimmy Smith told me to go find it. And of course, this is also pre-internet day, so I actually had to channel my youthful self and go back to the Whitehorse Public Library and check it out. And so I did. And it's kind of amazing if you think of what was in this plan. So this plan was written in the 60s for the Yukon in the distant future of 1985. And some of the things that they had in mind for us at that point was basically take the Yukon mining economy of the 1960s and 70s and supersize it. So they planned to have, 17,000 new workers, a forestry industry, 33 million board feet per year of production, dramatically higher, like 10 times higher industrial output, a population in the Yukon of 57,000, and a few assets they were going to build to support that in terms of infrastructure. Of course, there would be a standard gauge railway to BC. If you drive the Stewart Cassiar, you can still see some traces of the start of that project. There was going to be a smelter, there was going to be massive new power plants, there were going to be coal mines, steel smelters, and there were going to be commercial greenhouses and all this kind of stuff, and a whole bunch of new airports and roads to back that up. So that was the plan, agreed between the federal and the Yukon governments in the late 1960s. But we know what happened. There was an international crisis, an unexpected war that led to a spike in commodity and particularly oil prices, followed by a period of slow economic growth and inflation. Of course, that sounds a little bit familiar today, but at the time it was a huge shock, right? And so the Yukon was totally sideswiped by that. And after the Arab-Israeli war and the oil boycott, the slow growth of the 70s, where did we get to? The population in 1985 turned out to be 23,000. The 57,000 target, we're not even there today, many, many decades later. The power generation plan, 330 megawatts, didn't happen. We hit a third less than that. And as you'll all know, no steel smelter, no coal mine, commercial greenhouses are only getting started, and no iron ore mining. So this project was totally knocked off track, from a big historical point of view. And the Yukon, that when I was old enough to realize I was never going to make it to the NHL, by the time I got there, this stuff hadn't happened, and the mining picture was very, very different. So let's fast forward to today. So what this chart is it's the Yukon's real GDP, in constant 2012 dollars. And what you see is the economy has been growing steadily, and mining over the last generation has gone through a cycle where about 9% of the economy in the mid-90s, sort of a near-death experience around 2006 down to 2%, and then lately zooming up. Currently 14% of the Yukon economy is what Statistics Canada defines as mining. So that's the highest in a generation, and that's due to the hard work of everybody in this room, and it's quite a remarkable achievement given the environment that we've been in over the last 20 years. So that's quite impressive. That's 14%, 1/6, and of course, if you think about it, and this I think is something that a lot of people in Whitehorse and the Yukon more broadly don't think about, which is that base of mining, what does it support across the Yukon? So like I said before, the Statistics Canada definition is 14%, but if you look at the input-output tables and other sort of economic blah-blah in terms of how that goes into other industries, it's huge, right? So it's a huge amount of revenues for the First Nations and Yukon and municipal governments. It flows through because our tax system is so progressive. The well-paid mining jobs pay a lot of tax. It flows through into government revenues for health and education. Our transport infrastructure, is either, often you're on a road that was either built because of mining, for a mine, or is used and maintained for miners, right? And you think of how many fewer flights Air North could offer to Vancouver, or et cetera, if we didn't have all the mining traffic in the room, right? The electrical grid, its history is closely tied to the mining industry, and strategic expansions of it have both enabled the mining industry, but also secured cheap power for the rest of the grid. We could be like the Northwest Territories with a whole bunch of super microgrids. Most places in the Yukon have really good, relatively cheap power, which is great. And then if you go through the other sectors of the economy that were not in the 14% on my previous slide, you think about how many people stay in hotels, eat in restaurants, how many construction jobs are based on mining, how many First Nations and community firms, how many dev corps have businesses that make revenue off the mining industry. And Whitehorse businesses more broadly, from expediters to lawyers, right? It's a big deal. And high-paying jobs for Yukoners. So I tried to put this 14% of the Yukon mining sector in perspective. So 14% of the Yukon economy, about 1/7. You can see on the left here sort of public administration, health and education. Obviously, we're a government town. It's a very big chunk right there. Then you look across these other activities, real estate, construction, retail trade, info and culture industries, and so on. Sometimes people look at charts like this, and I've heard this a number of times, mining's only like 14% or 10% or whatever it was a few years ago. It's actually not that big. It's a lot of hassle. Why do we even need a mining industry? Let's just move past that. That's the past, not the future of the Yukon. But the way I look at it is supporting a whole bunch of these other jobs and activities in the Yukon. And furthermore, this is kind of a glass half full, glass half empty kind of thing. 14%, that's what it is today. It's changed dramatically over the last 10 or 20 years, and I think the potential is quite a bit higher. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. This is the similar sort of view if you look at it from the jobs point of view. So what's on the x-axis of this slide is each sort of sector of the economy: construction, mining. The government sectors are in blue: public admin, education, health, and social. and the green is the private sector dominated ones. So here again, it's the same story. You can see the red mining bar. It's not that high, it's not that wide, there's not that many jobs, and it's not the highest paid sector in the economy. So this is why you get some people saying, do we really need a mining sector in the future of the Yukon? But if you drill into this more carefully, a whole bunch of the jobs in these other sectors are dependent on that mining bar. And if that mining bar didn't exist, then the rest, all the other green bars and even some of the blue bars would be smaller, right? So I think that's a message that all of us have to keep, telling around town because it's not fully understood. Another thing that this slide brings up for me is the question of sustainability. So a lot of people talk about sustainability these days, and there's a bunch of different definitions. Many, they're all valid. But one definition in particular, think about it in terms of financial sustainability. If you think about the Yukon financial situation, that blue block of jobs on the right, 87% of the money for the Yukon government comes from Ottawa. That is a higher number than in 2016. So we are one financial crisis. We are one unexpected event, like the global financial crisis hit Spain and Ireland. Other crises have hit other countries. We are one federal financial crisis away from a devastating hit to that block. And mining is one of our main, maybe not our only, but one of our main diversifiers that protects us against that. And so if I'm thinking as a Yukoner about the long-term future of our territory, I need there to be more big green blocks on the slide, and mining is a critical enabler of those. Okay, so let's talk about, I promised you that I would talk about the future a little bit. So there's lots of things we could talk about mining in Yukon. We need, there's work to be done on legislation. There's work to be done on YESAB and our various approval processes. There's work to be done on social buy-in and acceptance of mining by Yukoners. There's work to be done on infrastructure. For example, if we end up not with a port in Skagway, that's going to be a problem. So there's lots of work to be done on those things, and people are working on them. What I want to talk about today is two things I'm calling game changers: geopolitics and climate change. Now, the word game changer is really an overused cliche, and I'm overusing it here, but these are really changing the game in the sense these are dramatic, changes in the environment that the Yukon mining sector is operating in, and this has huge implications, and I'm going to explain why some of those implications are very positive. So let's talk about geopolitics first. There's been a new era of geopolitical tension lately, as you all know, and this has really concentrated minds. So we all sort of knew for a long time that a lot of the mining, like after the Cold War ended, it was great. Many new regions of the world that had been off limits during the Cold War were now available for international mining companies to check out. You had countries in Africa, Kazakhstan, etc., being integrated into the global economic system, lots of access to great ore deposits, et cetera, et cetera. Now, however, in the post-Ukraine and what, a lot of analysts, including people at the Pentagon and so on, are now talking about maybe the pre-Taiwan period that we're in, we're really thinking about this in a more serious, different way. And so what this map is, it's a map of the world. It's got some of your favorite metals on it, cobalt, copper, lithium, and so on. And it shows where they are, where they are mined and processed. And so you just look at this map, and you see South America, Africa, China, Russia, Canada, the US, Australia, other countries are significant, but this is where the world's critical minerals are either coming from or being processed right now. And the places these are coming from in an era of geopolitical tension is a matter of concern. And this isn't just me or a few security experts talking about it. Serious people are seriously worried about this right now. This is a photo of German Chancellor Scholz during his visit to Canada in August. I had the opportunity to have dinner with a couple people from the Chancellor's office in Toronto and spoke to a number of other German business people. And having worked in Brussels, I know enough to be dangerous about German politics. So I was basically asking them, it's great that you guys have come over. These are good signals, but is this real? Are you all going to go back to Germany and then it'll be back to green left German politics as usual? And they very convincingly said, no, no, no. They said, the Chancellor himself said it very clearly. Usually when German leaders come to North America, they stop in Ottawa for a couple hours, say hi, and then go to the real meetings in Washington. This was the number one and the number two people in the German government coming specifically to Canada to talk about what? to actually ask us for liquefied natural gas and critical minerals. So let me just say that again, just let this sink in for a second. The top two leaders of Social Democrat, center-left Progressive Party in Germany, and the Green Party, a coalition of those parties, came to Canada and actually asked us for more minerals and more natural gas. That is something I don't think I possibly could have imagined, I would say, a couple years ago. And the other moves the German government have made it very clear that they are serious about this. And this is not a flash in the pan. This is a serious rethinking post-Ukraine of the trade, the supply chains, the economic relationships that Germany has. And the French and the British and the Koreans and the Japanese and the Americans are also thinking similar things. And at work, sometimes we do strategic simulations and modern wargaming, and the people at the Pentagon do that as well, and at the National Security Council in Washington. And so they are now rethinking this through. And let me tell you, if you start a geopolitical game with a map that looks like this, and you have a Taiwan crisis, it's a challenging situation for sure. And so now you have a situation where the Pentagon, under the Defense Production Act, is actually reaching out to Canadian mining companies to say, how can we support you? The Pentagon is actually asking you guys to look for, explore for, and develop critical minerals in a secure, stable environment. And that is a huge deal, and those are very serious people. So I guess my point is that if the so what of this for the Yukon mining industry is that this focus on critical minerals for geopolitical reasons is real, it's not going away, and I would bring up two words just to sum up here: obligation and opportunity. My view is this is an obligation for Canada and for the Yukon. Our allies that we've been allied with for 50 plus years, Germany, Japan, Korea, these folks, it's not like they would like to have our copper and our minerals. They need them for their future prosperity and security. And they want to buy them from a country or from a place that has environmental and socially sustainable rules and setups, and that is the Yukon. So that's actually our obligation, to take that request seriously when they fly over. And then it's, in economic terms, obviously, a huge opportunity for Yukon communities and everyone in this room. So I think this is a major game changer this was not the way it was in 2019 before the pandemic. So let's talk about climate for a moment. So my view is the pressure to act on climate is going to keep growing. This chart is from The Economist. It shows the total gigatons put out by the world economy in terms of carbon dioxide and its equivalent greenhouse gases, and how much those have to drop. And you can see the dark blue color at the bottom is to get to this famous limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then the lighter blue bar is 2 degrees, and the pink is where we're headed for, if we don't do too much more than what we've planned now. So there are a couple things to take away from this chart. One is it shows a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions, right? Which is going to be very difficult, but also very important. So sometimes we talk about charts like this with people, and they say, basically they say, these goals are extremely ambitious. Don't think they're ever going to happen, and we're kind of skeptical. But if you put these into a strategic game, you get a couple scenarios out of it. One is, what if we do actually do it, and you're doing business in an environment where your government and everyone around you and your competitors are all moving down the carbon curve, and you're left out? How does that turn out for you? And then secondly, suppose everyone around the world, all the other countries in the world, talk a big game and don't actually deliver on their carbon pledges. That's also possible. In that scenario, the climatic impacts of those carbon overshoots do not go away. That gets you to a world where possibly there's a series of severe climate incidents that result in a much more dramatic regulatory response in the early 2030s, which leaves people who have assets that were built now reliant on fossil fuels in a lot of trouble. You can make up scenarios where we don't do anything and the climate disasters don't happen, but that's a little bit like driving your snowmobile onto very thin ice in November. You need to be a bit bold to do that, and that might not be, that might not turn out well. So this issue is not going away. And there's a couple so what's from that for the mining industry. This chart is Canada's official plan to get to net zero in 2050. For the heavy industry where mining sits sector, a 33% reduction plan by 2030, the rest by 2050. That's very significant. And I think what that means is that You know, this conversation has changed so much just in the last couple of years in Canada, and it's going to continue to change and get more demanding. So you're all going to be in an environment where regulators, politicians, talent, citizens in your communities are going to be looking for mining projects that have, you know, low and declining carbon emissions. And that's just going to be a part of the business environment that you're working in, which is important to keep in mind. Secondly, the climate transition around the world is going to create a huge demand for minerals. This chart's from the International Energy Agency. It shows how much the demand for certain green minerals is going to increase under their Sustainable Development Scenario, which is their most aggressive decarbonization one, and under the so-called stated policies, which is a bit closer to status quo. What you can take away from this, for those at the back of the room, where it says lithium 41.9, that's not a 41.9% increase in lithium demand. That's a 41.9 times increase in lithium demand. And even for copper, that's off a low base for lithium, of course, but even if you look at copper on the far right, 1.7 to 2.7 times more copper is going to be required in the world for all those windmills, renewable heating systems, et cetera, their electric vehicles. That is, in economics terms, a shitload of copper that needs to be found and got to market, which, of course, for you guys is a huge opportunity. And once again, I would say also it's your obligation to find the copper to enable my lifestyle. So get going. The third takeaway is that Canada and possibly the Yukon are actually really advantaged in this world. What this chart is it's the global carbon curve for copper. And what it has on it, it's the greenhouse gas intensity per ton of copper on the y-axis, and then the supply stacked up by volume on the x-axis. And if you can't read the letters, basically Chile's in the middle, the USA and Australia are sort of a bit on the right, and then Kazakhstan and Mongolia are the high bars on the far right. And Canada is one of the lower bars on the left. So with our renewable power, technology, highly capable industry, there's a world where Canada is a producer of super low carbon metals. Of course, 20 years ago, this didn't really matter. It was all about your cost, your capital, and your OPEX, and so on. Now your carbon emissions matter, and Canada has the potential to be extremely advantaged on this front. I went onto the internet and surfed around a few big global copper projects and looked at their investor presentations. I picked one in Congo and one in Russia. So the Kamoa-Kakula project, absolutely enormous in the Congo. They are heavily highlighting how it's driven by renewable hydropower for that mine. And they say it's going to be among the world's lowest greenhouse gas emitter per unit of metal. And if you recall from the previous chart, the DRC was quite on the left, even more efficient than Canada. On the right is a Russian mine by Mskaya. There's Pevek in Siberia. It's actually closer to Old Crow than Vancouver is, if you go west along the Arctic coast. And what they've done there is they've put a couple of Russian nuclear submarine engines on a barge as a small modular reactor. And that power is feeding the town, local industry, and the surplus heat is actually heating the ex-Soviet apartment buildings, and believe it or not, also the town sauna. And now they intend to put, I think, 4 more of those in the bay to power this absolutely giant copper mine. So there's all kinds of issues with that, as you can imagine, but they're going to be able to say they're producing, quote, very low carbon copper. So these are the projects that are out there around the world, and the projects that investors, ESG analysts, other governments are looking at. And so the game is afoot, so to speak, on getting to low carbon mining. So here in the Yukon, that raises the question, what will the Yukon source of cheap and low carbon power be? So we have a bunch of things out there. It's pretty hard to imagine we would build another, Ajiac Dam in today's environment. It's possible we could connect to the BC grid, but that would be a big, expensive project. Maybe one of these things is the solution. The small modular reactors, one of those is, believe it or not, coming soon to Fairbanks, to the Eelson Air Force Base. They're going to have a Westinghouse E-Vinci there, this decade, probably by around 2027. Is there an equivalent of that in the Yukon? Is there an equivalent where there's a company in the Yukon that owns that the First Nations Yukon investors own, that's feeding low carbon power into the grid and to some new big mines? Interesting idea. Or there's geothermal. This is a picture of some geothermal plant in Iceland. And I know there are people in this room that are working on this idea in the Yukon right now. I was actually going to show you guys, I have this map from the Geological Survey of Canada that shows all the hotspots in the Yukon. And I was like, this is such a cool map. Then I realized it was going to be an economist showing it to geologists, and I might get myself into a lot of trouble. But you guys all know it. There's a lot of hot rocks here. And if we can find geothermal solutions that provide electricity and process heat for mining, this could be a huge game changer, right? And this kind of project that involves a big capital, investment up front and then very cheap operating expenses for geothermal electricity and power, that is ideally suited for a period of relatively low long-term interest rates. And there are a lot of federal infrastructure agencies and funding out there. So, I mean, this one's high on my list. I would love to see geothermal pop in a big way in the Yukon, and I hope that's successful. The other alternative is hydrogen, right? We know that big industrials in Seoul and Tokyo are looking at Canada, right? Because Western Canada, northern BC, northern Alberta have huge amounts of cheap natural gas. They also have huge amounts of carbon storage potential, right? And so the Japanese and Koreans are thinking about where can they get low carbon hydrogen to decarbonize their economies. We should be asking the same question. How are we going to get the blue hydrogen? Blue hydrogen is hydrogen that's made from natural gas with the carbon molecules ripped out and stored underground. How can we get blue hydrogen up the highway in a big and cheap way to power a whole bunch of our facilities of the future? And I think this is a very exciting possibility. So I don't really know which of these works. I haven't done business cases on them. They all have various technical issues. But I would say a couple things. For the people in the room working on these projects, these are fantastic, full speed ahead. For the people who work for the government in this room, I would say government support is going to be critical here. New energy systems do not just pop into being in geographies, quickly. It took us decades to switch over from wood heat to home heating fuel and diesel, et cetera. It took us decades. And bringing a new energy system into place isn't as easy as it was in 1900 when Willard Phelps Sr. and a few guys rode their horses up to Fish Lake, put in a generator, ran a wire back to Whitehorse, and declared that the southern Yukon had electricity. Much more complicated now. It's going to take public money, it's going to take political leadership, and it's going to take some long-term vision like Jimmy Smith had. And I think that's what we're going to need, because this is very strategic, and that's another overused word. But if the Yukon had abundant, cheap, low-carbon power, this would be fantastic for all of us who want to get rid of our oil furnaces and go with heat pumps. It would also be a huge enabler for a whole bunch of low-carbon mining properties in the Yukon in the future. So I would say, my take on mining in the Yukon is I'm very optimistic. We've got these huge tailwinds. We've got great geology. We've got the talent and experience, which is you guys. We've got this friendshoring trend where there are serious people in major countries who want to be our business partners and buy our minerals. And we've got this huge tidal wave of green metal demand coming at us. We're working on a bunch of stuff around governance and regulatory and infrastructure. We need to get that right. We need to work on that and keep up the hard work. But then we have these question marks. Can we move fast enough to catch the critical and green minerals window? And can we do cheap, low-carbon energy that enables a new generation of mines so that Jimmy Smith's vision of 1985 happens in 2035 and with very low carbon emissions? Thank you.